Come on.
I received that.
Yeah, you will.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all doing very
Great
well.
morning.
To start us off, I want to honor a few people,
Do it. Shout out.
particularly Pastor Jurgen and Leanne, and then
Yes,
Dr. Matt
yes,
and Pastor Michaela. I love the way that they have a heart for developing leaders, young people. That's why we're all here. And it's
Yes.
awesome to be here. I've seen life transformation after life transformation, and I'm looking forward to more. I was asked to give a message on the communion
Come
this
on.
morning.
Come
So that's what
Come
we're
on.
going to go. That's where we're going to go. Communion, as we know it, is based off of the Last Supper, with the wine and the bread. But as I was researching communion, the definition is essentially intimacy, closeness, togetherness. That's kind of what it's defined by. And I think that's interesting because as we see in the Last Supper, we're going to get into it, the Last Supper is Jesus's like most dire moment when he's at like his toughest situation.
Yeah.
The people that are closest to him fail him repeatedly. And I know that that's talked about, but I want to like really focus on that. So some setup is it's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's Passover. Jesus is going through the meal, and I imagine that it's probably like a relatively festive time. It is a feast after all. It's something that they're celebrating, their history. And Jesus then kind of changes the mood, again, I imagine, some interpretation here. He kind of changes the mood with the wine, the sharing of the wine, saying it's his blood, and the breaking of the bread, saying it's his body. He's saying that, do these things in remembrance of me, and the disciples are like, what are you talking about? Like, we're having a good time here. This is a feast. We're celebrating.
Yeah, that's good.
And then, like, right, the very next verse, Jesus is like, guys, one of you is going to betray me. Like, that's a mood killer
Yeah.
at a party. I don't know about you, but it's like, hey, we're having a good time. By the way, y'all a bunch of snakes. And so like, everybody's like, what's going on? And then we move on into Peter being like denying Jesus, and Jesus like calls him out on it. He's like,
Yeah.
hey Peter, before the end of tonight, you're gonna deny me 3 times.
Yeah.
And the number 3 shows up a couple times in this passage of the Last Supper. I don't
Yeah.
have the time to go into that, but it is something to take note of. And so Peter is gonna deny Jesus 3 times, but it also says that at the end of that the disciples will too.
Yeah.
So it's not just Peter
Yeah.
that is denying. And so there's our first foray into the friends of Jesus, the people that he calls his closest,
Wow, yeah.
are already going to fail him in his time of need. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus goes off and he's praying, and he asks the disciples to pray with him. And he comes back one time, they're asleep. He comes back a second time, they're asleep. He comes back a third time, and they're still asleep.
Yeah.
And so that's another example of 3 being the number of completion. And at that point, after the 3rd time, is when Judas comes to arrest Jesus. And in that moment, we've seen the disciples in action. Jesus asked for them to pray with him. And then we see disciples acting out of turn. We then see one of the disciples, some think it's Peter, whatever, then cuts off one of the servants of the high priest, cuts off his ear. And so it's like, disciples don't act, they don't pray, now they're acting when they shouldn't be. They're hurting people now, and Jesus is like, guys, come on, get your act together.
Yeah.
And then, so he heals that. And then finally, the final failure in this whole story is Jesus is taken away, and all of the disciples flee. They just forsake him completely.
Yeah.
We find out from another account that Peter follows, but then Peter denies Jesus 3 times later. And so all of that is to say, well, how does that relate to communion?
Yeah.
Go there.
Come on.
Communion is this moment of togetherness, but in this story we see Jesus' friends are forsaking that friendship, forsaking that togetherness, but we know that God has a bigger plan.
Yeah, he does.
We know that as Jesus is going through this tribulation, God is drawing all of humanity, past, present, and future,
Wow.
to him.
Yep.
And I think that we can use this as a lesson of encouragement, because it's like Jesus chose these people. He walked with them for years. They know him the best out of
Yeah.
anyone else, and he knew, God knew, that they would fail him. So if those people are going to fail him, like, look at that as encouragement. Not that we are
Yeah.
okay with being failures, but knowing that God knows our capabilities,
Come on.
he knows our successes,
Beautiful.
he knows our failures, and yet still he chose us.
Wow.
And
Come
those
on.
disciples
Wow.
came to be the fathers of
Beautiful.
Christianity as we know
Come
it
on.
today.
Come on. Wow. So good.
Take in that. Don't push away from God, judging yourself, being like,
Wow.
hey, I failed, I forsook God,
Yeah.
he can't use
So
me.
good.
Because the disciples did exactly that.
Come
If
on.
the disciples had then pushed away from God after Jesus died and was like, you know what? When he needed us, we weren't there. Let's just go off into obscurity.
Yeah.
Let's just pitter out the rest of our lives.
Yeah. Come on.
Christianity dies
Right.
there.
Yeah.
Straight up.
But God showed them
Come on.
his heart.
So
He
good.
empowered them with
Come
the
on.
Holy Spirit, and that's how we should live.
Woo!